disturbs the rotation of the Earth. Now, if man is under the urge to repeat the ancient catastrophic events, the ancient trauma,
Earth in Upheaval is a book about the great tribulations to which the planet on which we travel was subjected in prehistorical and historical times. The pages of this book are transcripts of the testimony of mute witnesses, the rocks, in the court of celestial traffic. They testify by their own appearance and by the encased contents of dead bodies, fossilized skeletons. Myriads upon myriads of living creatures came to life on this ball of rock, suspended in nothing, and returned to dust. Many died a natural death. Many were killed in wars between races and species, and many were entombed alive during the great paroxysms of nature in which land and sea contested in destruction. Whole tribes of fish that had filled the oceans suddenly ceased to exist. Of entire species and even genera of land animals, not a single survivor was left. The earth and the water, without which we cannot exist, suddenly turned into enemies and engulfed the animal kingdom, the human race included. And there was no shelter and no refuge. In such cataclysms, the land and the sea repeatedly changed places, laying dry the kingdom of the ocean and submerging the kingdoms of the land. In Worlds in Collision, I presented the chronicles of the very last series of such catastrophes, those that visited our Earth in the second and first millennia before the present era. Since these upheavals occurred in historical times, when the art of writing had already been perfected in the centers of ancient civilization, I described them mainly from historical documents, relying on celestial charts, calendars, and sundials, and water clocks, discovered by archaeologists, and drawing also upon classical literature, the sacred literature of East and West, the epics of the northern races, and the oral traditions of the primitive peoples from Lapland to the South Seas, geological vestiges of the events narrated in documents and traditions were indicated only here and there. When I felt that the immediate testimony of the rocks must be presented along with the historical evidence, I closed that description of cataclysmic events with a promise to attempt at a later date the reconstruction of similar global catastrophes of earlier times, one of them being the deluge. I had intended, after piecing together the history of these upheavals, to present geological and paleontological material to support the testimony of man. But the reception of Worlds in Collision by certain scientific groups persuaded me, before reviving the pageant of earlier catastrophes, to present, at least, some of the evidence of the rocks, which is as insistent as that carried down to our times by written records and by word of mouth. This testimony is never given in metaphors, and as with the pages of the Old Testament or of the Iliad, nothing can be changed in it. Pebbles and rocks and mountains in the bottom of the sea will bear witness. Did I know of the days, recent and ancient, when the harmony of this world was interrupted by the forces of nature? Have they entombed innumerable creatures and encased them in rock? Have they seen the ocean moving on continents and the continents sliding under water? Was this earth and the expanse of its seas showered with stones and covered by ashes? Were its forests uprooted by hurricanes and set afire, covered by tides carrying sand and debris from the bottom of the ocean? It takes millions of years for a log to be turned into coal, but only a single hour when burning. Here lies the core of the problem. Did the earth change in a slow process, a year added to a year and a million to a million? The peaceful ground of nature being the broad arena of the contest of throngs in which the fittest survived? Or did it happen, too, that the very arena itself, infuriated, rose against the contestants and made an end of their battles? I present here some pages from the Book of Nature. I have excluded from them all references to ancient literature, traditions, and folklore, and this I have done with intent, so that careless critics cannot decry the entire work as tales and legends. Stones and bones are the only witnesses. Mute as they are, they will testify clearly and unequivocally, yet dull ears and dimmed eyes will deny this evidence, and the dimmer the vision, the louder and more insistent will be the voices of protestation. This book was not written for those who swear by the verba magistri, the holiness of their school wisdom, and they may debate it without reading it as well. Author's note: in the body of Earth in Upheaval, I found nothing demanding revocation or change from the original edition of November 1955. Since then, it has been reprinted unchanged many times. Books uncompromising stand of the followers of uniformitarian dogma, whether called gradualists, evolutionists, or Darwinists. Nothing of radical change in nature has taken place in the past, because nothing like it is observable at present. A view without logic, imagination, or basis in fact began to show signs of fracturing, pressing deeper cracks, and in ultimate collapse. The term cataclysmic evolution entered scientific literature. The term new catastrophism was offered to let it appear that the new tenets differ from Velikovsky's views, and a minor key was struck repeatedly, even in recognizing the interference of elementary forces in the course of history. Thus, the great global disturbances of the 15th or 8th century before the present era were made to appear as the result of an explosion of a single volcano, Thera, in the Aegean Sea. Yet, in some instances, like the discovery of the great submarine ridge encompassing the globe almost twice, the discoverer felt compelled to exclaim in print, "The discovery at this late date of the mid-ocean ridge and rift has raised fundamental questions about basic geological processes and the history of the Earth, and has even had reverberations in cosmology." And his discovery of the whitish ash underlying the beds of all the oceans and seas, the so-called Worzel ash, J.L. Worzel, was led to exclaim in print, "It may be necessary to attribute the layer to a worldwide volcanism, or perhaps to the fiery end of bodies of cosmic origin." And then occasionally I was confronted with entire faculties of geophysicists, as in Madison, Wisconsin, in 1967. Who would claim that all signs of catastrophes resulted but from local events. I would prefer to the findings of Hazin or Worzel, or ask what local event could change the level of all oceans 34 centuries ago, as realized by R. Daly of Harvard in 1930, and confirmed by P. Kuchnin 1959, or change the climate all over the world, both 34 and 27 centuries ago. As clearly as the 1960s, I found that Earth in Upheaval was displacing the origin of species in the courses of a number of geophysics. As in the case of my visit to Oberlin College in 1965 at Princeton University, Earth in Upheaval, from its publication, and for 2 decades, was required reading in the paleontology course of Professor Glenn Jepson, H.H. Hess, chairman of the Department of Geology, later Geophysics, told me that he knew Earth in Upheaval by heart. He debated it with me at the first open meeting of Cosmos and Chronos, which he founded on the campus of Princeton University in January 1965 for study and discussion of my work. Such groups sprang up on other campuses too. Today, the groups studying in the physical and geophysical fields find a center in Cosmos and Chronos physical sciences. I said I would not revoke anything from the original, it's hard to make that word out, that's a little better, edition of 1955. However, to one section I would like to make some pertinent remarks. By the 1950s, the hypothesis, 1920, of A. Wagner about drifting continents gained an acceptance for the advancement of science. A roll call showed equal numbers of supporters and opponents. In the later 60s, the trend took a dramatic turn. The ever unsatisfactory part of the hypothesis, the nature of the force that causes the continents to drift, and unequal attraction of the moon on various latitudes, Wagner, and periodical radioactive heating of the interior of the Earth, du Toit, was tackled anew, and in some unintended way I had a part in it. Here is the story. The forum address before the graduate forum of Princeton University, printed as a supplement at the end of this book, was read on October 14, 1953. In it, I claimed that Jupiter, being a charged body, emits radio signals, and that Earth, being a charged body, possesses a magnetosphere, and further, that this magnetosphere reaches all the way to the lunar orbit. All three claims were subsequently confirmed under dramatic circumstances and mark epochal detections. But under pressure of a campaign led by elite of the scientific community, I was barred for over 9 years from any contact with the student body. Well, that's just dirty, except when H. Hess had his say. A number of times following the publication of Earth in Upheaval, late in 1955, Hess invited me to speak to an audience of the professors and graduate students of his department. My position on continental drift was, and is, intermediary between that of those who reject his concept, H. Jeffreys, the leading British geophysicist, and V.V. Belousov, the leading Russian geophysicist, never ceased to be its most outspoken opponents, and those who support the idea. I would therefore not recognize the outline of the present continents as everlasting features, only extended by the drift of continents. The moving force was there by inertia, and the displacement of the strata could continue at an ever-diminishing rate for centuries. The volcanic activity and earthquakes I described resulting from these very occurrences, and decreasing with time. Once a professor from the University of Rhodesia came to a lecture at the same auditorium where I usually offered my challenge, and told that this expedition found the magnetic remnant intensity of lavas in Somalia and Ethiopia 1,000-fold stronger than the terrestrial magnetic field. Half a Gauss could invest in these lavas when cooling below the Pierre Curie point. Further, he described that in Arabia, the magnetic remnant direction was found reversed from that of neighboring Somalia and Ethiopia on the African coast. Once more, I teased the audience. You have to turn around Arabia in relation to Africa. If you wish to explain the phenomenon by continental drift and the 1,000-fold strong magnetic remnants, you cannot explain even by rotating Arabia. One day, Hess showed me a design he was making of loops of magma traveling from the molten interior of the Earth toward its crust. He wished to hear my opinion on such loops. As a source of energy for moving continents, I did not show appreciation of such loops, entirely hypothetical, actually figments of an imagination. For a while I did not know that Harry, we started to call each other by our given names, made his theory known. I knew of enthusiastic supporters of plate tectonics like J. Tuzo Wilson of Toronto, but only from Walter Sullivan's Continents in Molten, 1974, did I learn that Hess was the originator of the idea, and then I remembered these Incidents. Paul Wesson of Cambridge University collected from scientific literature over 70 arguments against plate tectonics and drifting continents. I remain unswayed either by the enthusiasts or by their opponents, only by learning what happened to the Earth less than 4,000 years ago, of which we have an inexhaustible store of human testimony, a little of which is collected in Worlds in Collision, and another store of unexplained, but carry its own explanation, scenery. From all latitudes and longitudes may we arrive at the understanding which so many are still afraid to face. In Alaska. To the north of Mount McKinley, the tallest mountain in North America, the Tanana River joins the Yukon. From the Tanana Valley and the valleys of its tributaries, gold is mined out of gravel and muck. This muck is frozen mass of animals and trees. F. Rainey of the University of Alaska described the scene. Wide cuts, often several miles in length and sometimes as much as 140 feet in depth, are now being sliced out along stream valleys tributary to the Tanana in the Fairbanks district. In order to reach gold-bearing gravel beds, an overburden of frozen silt or muck is removed with hydraulic giants. This muck contains enormous numbers of frozen bones of extinct animals, such as the mammoth, mastodon, super bison, and horse. These animals perished in rather recent times. Present estimates place their extinction at the end of the Ice Age or in early post-glacial times. The soil of Alaska covered their bodies together with those of animals of species still surviving. Under what conditions did this great slaughter take place, in which millions upon millions of animals were torn limb from limb and mingled with uprooted trees? F. C. Hibben, of the University of New Mexico, writes, although the formation of the deposits of muck is not clear, there is ample evidence that at least portions of this material were deposited under catastrophic conditions. Mammal remains are for the most part dismembered and disarticulated, even though some fragments yet retain, in their frozen state, portions of ligaments, skin, hair, and flesh. Twisted and torn trees are piled in splintered masses. At least 4 considerable layers of volcanic ash may be traced in these deposits, although they are extremely warped and distorted. Could it be that a volcanic eruption killed the animal population of Alaska? The streams carrying down into the valleys and bodies of the slaughtered animals. A volcanic eruption would have charred the trees, but would not have splintered them. If it killed animals, it would not have dismembered them. The presence of volcanic ash indicates that volcanic eruption did take place, and repeatedly, in 4 consecutive stages of the same epoch. It is also apparent that the trees could have been uprooted and splintered only by hurricane or flood, or a combination of both agencies. The animals could have been dismembered only by a stupendous wave that lifted and carried and smashed and tore and buried millions of bodies and millions of trees. Also, the area of the catastrophe was much greater than the action of a few volcanoes could have covered. Muck deposits like those in the Tanana River Valley are found in the lower reaches of the Yukon, in the western part of the peninsula, on the Koyukuk River that flows into the Yukon from the north, and on the Kuskokwim River that empties its waters into the Bering Sea, and at several places along the Arctic coast, and so may be considered to extend in greater or lesser thickness over all unglaciated areas of the northern peninsula. What could have caused the Arctic Sea and the Pacific Ocean to erupt and wash away forests with all their animal population and throw the entire mingled mass in great heaps scattered all over Alaska, the coast of which is longer than the Atlantic seaboard from Newfoundland to Florida, Was it not a tectonic revolution in the Earth's crust that also caused the volcanoes to erupt and to cover the peninsula with ashes? In various levels of the muck, stone artifacts were found, frozen in situ at great depths and in apparent association with the Ice Age fauna, which implies that men were contemporary with extinct animals in Alaska. Worked flints, characteristically shaped, called Yuma points, were repeatedly found in the Alaskan muck, 100 and more feet below the surface. One such spear point was found there between a lion's jaw and a mammoth's tusk. Similar weapons were used only a few generations ago by the Indians of the Athabascan tribe, who camped in the upper Tanana Valley. It has also been suggested that even modern Eskimo points are remarkably Yuma-like, all of which indicates that the multitudes of torn animals and splintered forests date from a time not many thousands of years ago. The Ivory Islands. The Arctic coast of Siberia is cold, bleak, and inhospitable. The sea is passable for ships maneuvering between floating ice for 2 months of the year. From September to the middle of July, the ocean north of Siberia is fettered, an unbroken desert of ice. Polar winds sweep over the frozen tundras of Siberia, where no tree grows and the soil is never tilled. In this exploratory voyage on the ship Vega in 1878, Nils Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld, the first to traverse the Northern Seaway from one end to the other, traveled for weeks along the coast from Novaya Zemlya to Cape Shelagoskoy, 170 degrees 30 east, on the eastern extremity of Siberia, without seeing a single human being on the shore. Fossil tusks of the mammoth and extinct elephant were found in northern Siberia and brought southward to markets at a very early time, possibly in the days of Pliny. In the first century of the present era, the Chinese excelled in working delicate designs in the ivory, much of which they obtained from the north and from the days of the conquest of Siberia, 1582, by the Cossack Yermak under Ivan the Terrible until our own times. Trade in mammoth tusks has gone on. Northern Siberia provided more than half the world's supply of ivory, many piano keys and billiard balls being made from the fossil tusks of these mammoths. In 1797, the body of a mammoth with flesh, skin, and hair was found in northeastern Siberia, and since then bodies of other mammoths have been unearthed from the frozen ground in various parts of the region. The flesh had the appearance of freshly frozen beef. It was edible, and wolves and sled dogs fed on it without harm. The ground must have been frozen ever since the day they were entombed. Had it not been frozen, the bodies of the mammoths would have been putrefied in a single summer. But they remained unspoiled for some thousands of years. It is, therefore, absolutely necessary to believe that the bodies were frozen up immediately after the animals died, and were never once thawed until the day of their discovery. High in the north, above Siberia, 600 miles inside the polar circle, in the Arctic Ocean, lie the Liakov Islands. Liakov was a hunter who, in the days of Catherine II, ventured to these islands and brought back the report that they abounded in mammoth bones. Such was the enormous quantity of mammoths' remains that it seemed that the island was actually composed of the bones and tusks of elephants, cemented together by icy sand. The New Siberian Islands, discovered in 1805 and 1806, as well as the islands of Stolbovoy and Belkov to the west, present the same picture. The soil of these desolate islands is absolutely packed full of the bones of elephants and rhinoceroses in astonishing numbers. These islands were full of mammoth bones, and the quantity of tusks and teeth of elephants and rhinoceroses found in the newly discovered island of New Siberia was perfectly amazing and surpassed anything which had yet been discovered. Did the animals come there over the ice, and for what purpose? On what food could they have lived? Not on the lichens of the Siberian tundras, covered by deep snow most of the year, and still less on the moss of the polar islands, which are frozen 10 months in the year. Mammoths, members of the Forcarius elephant family, require huge quantities of vegetable food every day in the year. How could large herds of them have existed in a country like northeast Siberia, which is regarded as the coldest place in the world, and where there was no food for them? Mammoth tusks have been dredged in nets from the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, and after Arctic gales, the shores of the islands were strewn with tusks cast up by the billows. This is regarded as an indication that the bottom of the Arctic Ocean between the islands and the mainland was dry land in the days when mammoths roamed there. George Cuvier, the great French paleontologist, 1769 to 1832, thought that in a vast catastrophe of continental dimensions the sea overwhelmed the land. The herds of mammoths perished, and in a second spasmodic movement the sea rushed away, leaving the carcasses behind. The catastrophe must have been accompanied by a precipitous drop in temperature. The frost seized the dead bodies and saved them from decomposition. In some mammoths, when discovered, even the eyeballs were still preserved. Charles Darwin, who denied the occurrence of continental catastrophes in the past, in a letter to Sir Henry Haworth, admitted that the extinction of mammoths in Siberia was for him an insoluble problem. So he just decided to run away from it and ignore it. J.D. Dana, the leading American geologist of the second half of the last century, wrote, "The encasing in ice of huge elephants and the perfect preservation of the flesh shows that the cold finally became suddenly extreme, as of a single winter's night, and knew no relenting afterward. In the stomachs and between the teeth of the mammoths were found plants and grasses that do not grow now in northern Siberia. The contents of the stomachs have been carefully examined. They show the undigested food, leaves of trees, now found in southern Siberia, but a long way from the existing deposits of ivory. Microscopic examination of the skin showed red blood corpuscles, which was proof not only of a sudden death, but that the death was due to suffocation, either by gases or water, evidently the latter in this case. But the puzzle remained to account for the sudden freezing up of this large mass of flesh so as to preserve it for future ages. What could have caused a sudden change in the temperature of the region? Today, the country does not provide food for large quadrupeds. The soil is barren and produces only moss and fungi a few months in the year. At that time, the animals fed on plants, and not only mammoths pastured in northern Siberia and on the islands of the Arctic Ocean. On Kolonoy Island, neither trees nor shrubs nor bushes exist, and yet the bones of elephants, rhinoceroses, buffaloes, and horses are found in this icy wilderness in numbers which defy all calculation. When Hedenstrom and Sannikov discovered the New Siberian Islands in 1806, they found in the desolate wilderness of Polar Sea the remains of enormous petrified forests. These forests could be seen tens of miles away. The trunks of the trees in these ruins of ancient forests were partly standing upright and partly lying horizontally, buried in the frozen soil. Their extent was very great. Hedenstrom described them as follows. On the southern coast of New Siberia, we found the remarkable wood hills, piles of trunks. They are 30 fathoms, 180 feet high, and consist of horizontal strata and sandstone, alternating with strata of bituminous beams, or trunks of trees. On ascending these hills, fossilized charcoal is everywhere, covered apparently with ashes. But on closer examination, this ash is also found to be a petrification, and so hard that it can be scarcely scraped off with a knife. Some trunks are fixed perpendicular to the sandstone, with broken ends. In 1829, the German scientist G.A. Ehrmann went to the Velikovsky and the New Siberian Islands to measure there the magnetic field of the Earth. He described the soil as full of bones of elephants, rhinoceroses, and buffaloes, and the piles of wood, he wrote. In New Siberia Island, on the declivities facing the south, lie hills 250 or 300 feet high, formed of driftwood. The ancient origins, as well as of the fossil wood in the tundras, anterior to the history of the Earth in its present state, strikes at once even the most uneducated hunters. Other hills on the same island and on Kalanoi, which lies further to the west, are heaped up to an equal height with skeletons of pachyderms, elephants, rhinoceroses, bisons, etc., which are cemented together by frozen sand, as well as by strata and veins of ice. On the summit of the hills, they, the trunks of trees, lie flung upon one another in the wildest disorder, forced upright in spite of gravitation, and with their tops broken off or crushed, as if they had been thrown with great violence from the south on a bank, and there heaped up. It just seems like they were snapped like matchsticks. Eduard von Toll repeatedly visited the New Siberian Islands from 1885 to 1902, when he perished in the Arctic Ocean. He examined the wood hills and found them to consist of carbonized trunks of trees, with impressions of leaves and fruits. On Malloy, one of the group of Velikovsky Islands, Toll found bones of mammoth and other animals together with the trunks of fossil trees, with leaves and cones. This striking discovery proves that in the days when the mammoths and rhinoceroses lived in northern Siberia, these desolate islands were covered with great forests and a bore of luxuriant vegetation. A hurricane apparently uprooted the trees of Siberia and flung them to the extreme north. Mountainous waves of the ocean piled them in huge hills, and some agent of bituminous nature transformed them into charcoal, either before or after they were deposited and cemented in drifted masses of sand, and became baked into sandstone. These petrified forests were swept from northern Siberia into the ocean, and together with bones of animals and drifted sand built the islands. It may be that not all the charred trees and the mammoths and other animals were destroyed and swept away in a single catastrophe. It is more probable that one huge cemetery of animals and trees came flying through the air on the crest of a retreating tidal wave, to settle astride another, older cemetery, deep in the polar circle. The scientists who explored the muck beds of Alaska have not reflected upon the similarity in appearance of animal remains there and in polar regions of Siberia and on Arctic islands, and have therefore not discussed a common cause. The exploration of the New Siberian Islands, 1,000 miles away from Alaska, was the work of 18th and 19th century academicians who followed the hunters of fossil ivory. The exploration of Alaskan soil was the work of 20th century scientists who followed the gold-digging machines, of course. These two observations, one old and one new, came from the north, before presenting many more from all parts of the world. I shall review a few dominant theories on the history of our Earth and its animal kingdom. We shall read in brief, in the original statements of the authors, how the earlier naturalists explained the phenomena, how subsequently the same phenomena were interpreted in terms of slow evolution, and how in the last 80 years more and more facts have presented themselves that do not square with the picture of a peaceful world, molded in a slow and uneventful process. End of chapter. Wonder, why is it that the mainstream scientists are so against Velikovsky getting any credit or having any say? And the only thing that I can think of is that, first of all, he hasn't done anything not one of them couldn't have done. He has taken the mainstream sources that were there all along and just put them together and connected the dots. But Charles Ginenthal said something that stuck in my head, and I still remember it. He said that they would rather gouge their eyeballs out than admit he's right, and the only thing it could be is that he's so far ahead of his time that they just haven't been able to think on the same level. And that is sad. Chapter 2. Revolution. The Erratic Boulders. The waters of the ocean, in which our mountains had been formed, still covered a part of these Alps, when a violent paroxysm of the globe suddenly opened great cavities, and ruptured many rocks. The waters were carried toward these abysses with extreme violence, falling from the height they were before. They crossed deep valleys, and dragged immense quantities of earth, sand, and debris of all kinds of rocks. This mass, shoved along by the onrush of great waters, was left spread up the slopes, where we still see many scattered fragments. Thus did Horace Benedict de Saussure, foremost Swiss naturalist of the end of the 18th century, explain the presence of stones broken off from the Alps and carried to the Jura Mountains to the west. So also did he explain the marine remains found in alpine ridges and the sand, gravel, and clay that fill the valleys of the Alps and the plains beyond them. The loose rocks lying on the Jura Mountains were torn from the Alps. In their mineral composition they differ from the rock formations of the Jura, showing their alpine origin. Rocks that differ from the formations on which they lie are called erratic boulders. These stone blocks lie on the Jura Mountains at an elevation of 2,000 feet above Lake Geneva. Some of them are thousands of cubic feet in size, and Pierre Martin is over 10,000 cubic feet. They must have carried across the space now occupied by the lake and lifted to the height where they are found. These are erratic boulders in many places of the world. In the British Isles, on the shore, and in the Highlands are enormous quantities of them, transported there across the North Sea from the mountains of Norway. Some force wrested them from those massifs, bore them over the entire expanse that separates Scandinavia from the British Isles, and set them down on the coast and on the hills. From Scandinavia, boulders were also carried to Germany and spread over that country, in some places so thickly that it seems as though they had been brought there by masons to build cities. Also, high in the Harz Mountains in central Germany lie stones that originated in Norway. Wow, can you imagine that? I mean, we must be talking massive winds. From Finland, blocks of stone were swept to the Baltic regions and over Poland and lifted onto the Carpathians. Another train of boulders was fanned out from Finland, over the Valdai Hills, over the site of Moscow, and as far as the Don. In North Africa, erratic blocks broken from granite of Canada and Labrador were spread over Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Michigan, New York, Wisconsin, and Ohio. They perch on top of ridges and lie on slopes and deep in the valleys. They lie on the coastal plain and on the White Mountains and on the Berkshires, sometimes in an unbroken chain. In the Pocono Mountains, they balance precariously on the edge of crests. The attentive traveler through the woods wonders at the size of these rocks, brought there and abandoned sometime in the past, frighteningly piled up. Some erratics are enormous. The block near Conway, New Hampshire, is 90 by 40 by 38 feet and weighs about 10,000 tons, the load of a large cargo ship. Equally large is Mohegan Rock, which towers over the town of Montville in Connecticut. The Great Flat Erratic in Warren County, Ohio, weighs approximately 13,500 tons and covers 3/4 of an acre. The Ototoks Erratic, 30 miles south of Calgary, Alberta, consists of 2 pieces of quartzite derived from at least 50 miles to the west, of a calculated weight of over 18,000 tons, blocks of 250 to 300 feet in circumference, however, are small when compared with the mass of chalkstone near Malmo in southern Sweden, which is 3 miles long, 1,000 feet wide, and from 100 to 200 feet in thickness, which has been transported an indefinite distance. It is quarried for commercial purposes. A similar transported slab of chalk is found on the eastern coast of England, upon which a village had unwittingly been built, in innumerable places on the surface of the earth, as well as on isolated islands in the Atlantic and Pacific, and in Antarctica lie rocks of foreign origin, as well as on isolated islands in the Atlantic and Pacific, and in Antarctica lie rocks of foreign origin, brought from afar by some great force. Broken off from their parent mountain ridges and coastal cliffs, they were carried down dale and uphill and over land and sea. Sea and land changed places. The most renowned naturalist to come from the generation of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars was Georges Cuvier. He was the founder of vertebrate paleontology, or the science of fossil bones, and thus of the science of extinct animals, studying the finds made in the gypsum formation of the Montmartre in Paris, and those elsewhere in France and the European continent. In general, he came to the conclusion that in the midst of even the oldest strata of marine formations, there are other strata replete with animal or plant remains of terrestrial or freshwater forms, and that among the more recent strata, or those that are nearer the surface, there are also land animals buried under heaps of marine sediment. It has frequently happened that lands which have been laid dry have been again covered by waters, in consequence either of their being engulfed in the abyss, or of the sea having merely risen over them. These repeated interruptions and retreats of the sea have neither all been slow nor gradual. On the contrary, most of the catastrophes which have occasioned them have been sudden, and this is especially easy to be proven with regard to the last of these catastrophes, that which by the twofold motion has inundated and afterwards laid dry our present continents, or at least a part of the land which forms them at present day. The breaking to pieces, the raising up and overturning of the older strata of the earth leave no doubt upon the mind that when they have been reduced to the state in which we now see them by the action of sudden and violent causes, and even the force of the motions excited in the mass of waters is still attested by the heaps of debris and rounded pebbles which are in many places interposed between the solid strata. Life, therefore, has often been disturbed on this earth by terrific events. Numberless living beings have been the victims of these catastrophes. Some, which inhabited the dry land, have been swallowed up by inundations. Others, which peopled the waters, have been laid dry, the bottom of the sea having been suddenly raised. Their very races have been extinguished forever, and have left no other memorial of their existence than some fragments which the naturalist can scarcely recognize. Cuvier was surprised to find that life has not always existed upon the globe, for there are deep strata which contain no vestiges of living beings. The sea without inhabitants would seem to have prepared materials for the mollusca and zoophytes, and when they appeared and populated the sea, they deposited their shells and built coral, at first in small numbers and eventually in vast formations. Cuvier believed that changes have operated in nature, not just since the appearance of life, for the land masses formed previous to that event also seemed to have experienced violent displacements. He found in the gypsum deposits in the suburbs of Paris marine limestone containing over 800 species of shells, all of them marine. Under this limestone there is another freshwater deposit formed of clay. Among the shells, all of the fresh water, or land origin, There are also bones. But what is remarkable, the bones are those of reptiles, and not mammals, crocodiles, and tortoises. Much of France was once sea, then it was land, populated by land reptiles. Then it became sea again, and was populated by marine animals. Then it was land again, inhabited by mammals. Then it was once more sea, and again land. Each stratum contains the evidence of its age in the bones and shells of animals that lived and propagated there at the time and were entombed in recurrent upheavals. And as it was on the site of Paris, so it was in other parts of France and in other countries of Europe. The strata of the earth disclose that the thread of operations is here broken. The march of nature is changed, and none of the agents which she now employs would have been sufficient for the production of her ancient works. That's his strongest point, isn't it? There's nothing that we know of today that could cause all that. Throwing boulders around and making land and sea trade places. And the evidence is in the strata, so science knows about it. They just choose not to do anything. They just ignore it. Obviously, knowing what we know, that it would take something extraterrestrial to do something like that. There's no doubt about it. Oh, Mother Nature can be sneaky. We have no evidence that the sea can now encrust those shells with a paste as compact as that of the marbles, the sandstones, or even the coarse limestone. In short, all now active causes united would not change, in an appreciable degree, the level of the sea nor raise a single stratum above its surface. It has been asserted that the sea has undergone a general diminishing of level, admitting that there has been a gradual diminution of the waters, that the sea has transported solid matter in all directions, that the temperature of the globe is either diminishing or increasing. None of these cases could have overturned our strata, enveloped in ice large animals with their flesh and skin, laid dry marine animals, and lastly destroyed numerous species and even entire genera. Thus we repeat, it is in vain that we search among the powers which now act at the surface of the earth for causes sufficient to produce the revolutions and catastrophes, the traces of which are exhibited by its crust. But what could have caused these catastrophes? Cuvier reviewed the theories of the origin of the world current in his time, but found no answer to the question that preoccupied him. He did not know the cause of these vast cataclysms. He only knew that they had occurred. Many fruitless efforts had been made, and he felt that his search for the causes of the cataclysms was fruitless too. These ideas have haunted, I may almost say have tormented me during my researches among fossil bones. End of subchapter. The Caves of England. In 1823, William Buckland, professor of geology at the University of Oxford, published his Reliques de l'Eau, Relics of the Flood, with the subtitle Observations on the Organic Remains Contained in Caves, Fissures, and Diluvial Gravel, and on other geological phenomena attesting to the action of the universal deluge. Buckland was one of the great authorities on geology of the first half of the 19th century. In a cave in Kirkdale in Yorkshire, 80 feet above the valley, under a floor covering of stalagmites, he found teeth and bones of elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotami, horses, deer, tigers, the teeth of which were larger than those of the largest lion or Bengal tiger. Bears, wolves, hyenas, foxes, hares, rabbits, as well as bones of ravens, pigeons, larks, snipe, and ducks. Many of the animals had died before the first set, or milk teeth, had been shed. Certain scholars, prior to Buckland, had their own explanation for the provenance of elephant bones in the soil of England, and to them Buckland referred the idea, which long prevailed and was considered satisfactory by the antiquaries, archaeologists, of the last century. was that they were the remains of elephants imported by the Roman armies. This idea is also refuted, first by the anatomical facts of their belonging to an extinct species of genus. Second, by their being usually accompanied by the bones of rhinoceros and hippopotamus, animals which could never have been attached to the Roman armies. Thirdly, by their being found dispersed over Siberia and North America in equal or even greater abundance than in those parts of Europe which were subjected to Roman power. It appeared that hippopotamus and reindeer and bison lived side by side at Kirkdale. Hippopotamus, reindeer, and mammoth pastured together at Brentford, near London. Reindeer and grizzly bear lived with the hippopotamus at Cefn in Wales. It could be Cefn. Lemming and reindeer bones were found together with bones of the cave lion and hyena at Bleeden in Somerset. Hippopotamus, bison, and musk sheep were found together with worked flint in the gravels of the Thames Valley. The remains of reindeer lay on the bones of mammoth and rhinoceros in the cave of Bécu in France, in the same red clay encased by the same stalagmites. At Arcy, France, also in a cave, bones of the hippopotamus were found with bones of the reindeer, and with them a worked flint. According to the prophecy of Isaiah 11:6, in messianic times to come, the lion and the calf would pasture together. But even prophetic vision has not conceived of a reindeer from snow-covered Lapland and a hippopotamus from the tropical Congo River living together on the British Isles or in France. Yet they did leave their bones in the same mud of the same caves, together with the bones of other animals in the strangest assortments. These animal bones were found in gravel and clay, to which Buckland gave the name diluvium. Buckland was concerned to establish two important facts. First, that there has been a recent and general inundation of the globe, and second, that the animals whose remains were found interred in the wreck of that inundation were natives of high north latitudes. The presence of tropical animals in northern Europe cannot be solved by supposing them to migrate periodically. In the case of crocodiles and tortoises, extensive immigration is almost impossible, and not less so to such an unwieldy animal as the hippopotamus when out of the water. But how could they live in the cold of northern Europe, Buckland says? It is equally difficult to imagine that they would have passed their winters in lakes and rivers frozen up with ice. If cold-blooded land animals are unable to hide themselves in the ground over the winter in icy climates, their blood would freeze solid. They lack the ability to regulate the temperature of their bodies. Like Cuvier, Buckland was nearly certain that if any change of climate has taken place, it took place suddenly. Of the time the catastrophe occurred, which covered with mud and pebbles the bones in the Kirkdale cave, Buckland wrote, "From the limited quantity of post-diluvian stalactite, as well as from the undecayed condition of the bones, one must deduce that the time elapsed since the introduction of the diluvial mud has not been of excessive length. The bones were not yet fossilized. Their organic matter was not yet replaced by minerals." Buckland thought that the time elapsed since the diluvial catastrophe could not have exceeded 5,000 or 6,000 years. The figure adopted also Deluc, Dolomieu, and Cuvier, each of which presented his own reasons. Then the illustrious geologist added these words: "What the cause was, whether a change in the inclination of the Earth's axis, or a near approach of a comet, or any other cause or combination of causes, purely astronomical, is a question the discussion of which is foreign to the object of the present memoir." End of subchapter. The aquatic graveyards. The old red sandstone is regarded as one of the oldest strata with signs of extinct life in it. No animal life higher than fish is found there. Whatever the age of this formation, it carries the testimony and a wonderful record of violent death falling at once, not on a few individuals, but on whole tribes. In the late 30s of the last century, Hugh Miller made the old red sandstone in Scotland the special subject of his investigations. He observed the earth had already become a vast sepulchre to a depth, the bed of the sea, equal to at least twice the height of Ben Nevis over its surface. Ben Nevis, in the Grampian Mountains, is the highest peak in Great Britain, 4,406 feet high. The stratum of the old red sandstone is twice as thick. This formation presents the spectacle of an upheaval, immobilized at a particular moment and petrified forever. Hugh Miller wrote, "The first period represented by the old sandstone seems, in what now forms the northern half of Scotland, to have opened in a similar manner. The vast space, which now includes Orkney and Loch Ness, Dingwall and Gammery, I hope I pronounced them right, and many 1,000 square miles besides, was the scene of a shallow ocean perplexed by powerful currents and agitated by waves. A vast stratum of water-rolled pebbles, varying in depth from 100 feet to 100 yards, remains in 1,000 different localities, to testify of the disturbing agencies of this time of commotion." Miller found that the hardest masses in the stratum peripheries of vitreous fracture that cut glass as rapidly as flint, and masses of quartz that strike fire quite as profusely from steel, are yet polished and ground down into bullet-like forms, and yet it is surely difficult to conceive how the bottom of any sea should have been so violently and so equally agitated for so greatly extended a space, and for a period so prolonged that the entire area should have come to be covered with a stratum of rolled pebbles of almost every variety of ancient rock, 15 stories height and thickness. In the red sandstone, an abundant aquatic fauna is embedded. The animals are in disturbed positions. At the period of the past when these formations were composed, some terrible catastrophe involved in sudden destruction the fish of an area at least 100 miles from boundary to boundary, perhaps much more. The same platform in Orkney as at Cromarty is strewn thick with remains which exhibit unequivocally the marks of violent death. The figures are contorted, contracted, curved. The tails, in many instances, is bent around to the head. The spines stick out. The fins are spread to the full, as in fish that die in convulsions. The Batyraches shows its arms extended at their stiffest angle, as if prepared for an enemy. The attitudes of all of the ichthyolites, any fossil fish, on this platform are attitudes of fear, anger, and pain. The remains, too, appear to have suffered nothing from the after-attacks of predaceous fishes. None such seem to have survived. The record is one of destruction at once widely spread and total. What agency of destruction could have accounted for innumerable existences of an area perhaps 10,000 square miles in extent being annihilated at once? Conjecture lacks footing in grappling with the enigma, and expatiates in uncertainty over all known phenomena of death, wrote Miller. The ravages of no disease, however virulent, could explain some of the phenomena of this arena of death. Rarely does disease fall equally on many different genera at once. And never does it strike with instantaneous suddenness. Yet, in the ruins of this platform, from 10 to 12 district genera and many species were involved, and so suddenly did the agency perform its work that its victims were fixed in their first attitude of surprise and terror. The area of the old red sandstone, investigated by Miller, comprises one half of Scotland, from Loch Ness to the land's northern extremity and beyond, to the Orkney Islands in the north. 1,000 different localities disclose the same scene of destruction. An identical picture can be found in many other places all around the world, in similar and dissimilar formations. Of Monte Bolca, near Verona in northern Italy, Buckland wrote, "The circumstances under which the fossil fishes are found at Monte Bolca seem to indicate that they perish suddenly. The skeletons of these fish lie parallel to the laminae of the strata of the calcareous slate. They are always entire and closely packed on one another. All these fishes must have died suddenly, and have been speedily buried in the calcareous sediment. Then, in the course of deposition, from the fact that certain individuals have ever preserved traces of color upon their skin, we are certain that they were entombed before decomposition of their soft parts had taken place." The same author wrote about the fish deposits in the area of the Harz Mountains in Germany. Another celebrated deposit of fossil fishes is that of the califerous slate surrounding the Harz. Many of the fishes of this slate at Mansfield, Eiselben, etc., have a distorted attitude, which has often been assigned to writhing and agonies of death. As these fossil fishes maintain the attitude of a rigid stage immediately succeeding death, it follows that they were buried before putrefaction had commenced, and apparently in the same bituminous mud, the influx of which had caused their destruction. The story of agony and sudden death and immediate encasing is told by the red sandstone of Scotland, the limestone of Monte Bolca in Lombardy, the bituminous slate in Mansfield in Thuringia, and also by the coal formation of Saarbrücken on the Saar. The most celebrated deposits of fossil fishes in Europe, the calcareous slate of Solenhofen, the blue slate of Glarus, and the marl stone of Ossigen, Switzerland, and of Aix-en-Provence, to mention only a few of the better-known sites. In North America, similar strata, packed full of splendidly preserved fishes, are found in the black limestone of Ohio and Michigan, and in the Green River bed of Arizona. I wish you would have said what city in Michigan. The diatom beds of Lompoc, California, and in many other formations. In cataclysms of early ages, fishes died in agony, and the sand and the gravel of the upthrust sea bottom covered the aquatic graveyards. The doctrine of uniformity. For over 25 years, from the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789 to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Europe was in turmoil. France beheaded her king and queen. Many revolutionaries, in their turn, went to the scaffold too. Spain, Italy, Germany, Austria, and Russia became battlefields. The British Isles were in danger of being invaded, and Britain's fleet fought at Trafalgar, the tyrant who had sprung up from the Revolutionary Army. After 1815, there was a universal desire for peace and tranquility. The Holy Alliance was organized. Europe sank into reaction, England into a spirit of conservatism. The abortive revolutionary wave of 1830 did not reach the British Isles. I mean, they just keep the empire going. No wonder that in the climate of reaction to the eruptions of revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the theory of uniformity became popular and soon dominant in the natural sciences. According to this theory, the development of the surface of the globe has been going on through all the ages without any disturbances. The process of very slow change that we observe at present has been the only process of importance from the beginning. This theory, first advanced by Hutton, 1795, and Lamarck, 1800, was elevated to its present position as a scientific law by Charles Lyell, a young attorney whose interest in geology was to make him the most influential person in that field, and by Lyell's disciple and friend Charles Darwin. Darwin built his theory of evolution on Lyell's principle of uniformity. A modern exponent of the theory of evolution, H.F. Osborn, wrote, "Present
continuity implies the improbability of past catastrophism and violence of change, either in the lifeless or in the living world. Moreover, we seek to interpret the changes and laws of past time through those which we deserve at the present time."
This was Darwin's secret, learned from Lyell. Lyell built his case with convincing dialectics. Wind and solar heat and rain, little by little, crumble the rock in the highlands. Rivers carry the detritus to the sea. The land is lowered by this process, which continues for ages. It's kind of like a cow, just standing there eating grass,
chewing his cud,
until it churns a vast region into detritus. Then the massive earth, as if in a slow-breathing process, every phase of which requires eons, again slowly rises. The bottom of the sea subsides, and the crumbling of the rock begins all over again. The land comes up in the elevated plateau. The subsequent action of water and wind cuts furrows, and little by little the highland changes into a range of mountain peaks, like that little tiny Colorado River carved that immense Grand Canyon. But it had some kind of magic way to get rid of all the residue, because there is no residue. You can't find it anywhere. The reason why you can't is because it was blasted into outer space from thunderbolts by a close planet. I always just get so amazed that people actually believe that that little river, carved that big canyon. And then there's more, but that's just the beginning. In fact, there are many mysterious things about the Grand Canyon that we don't know about and we're not being told about. And we're going to be talking about it on the next Oddities show. I found some pretty interesting stuff, but that's another show. Back to the book. The fact is that evolution needs billions of years, and, well, that just so happens to take care of the Big Bang, evolution, and uniformity, all in one. Boom. And they're all in it together. They call it a paradigm, and anybody who steps outside of the paradigm gets ostracized. That is not science. That's anything but science. That's like a religion. Okay, I'll stop now. Highland changes into a range of mountains, peaks. More eons, and those heights crumble too. Wind and rain carrying them grain by grain into the sea. The shallow sea encroaches on the land, then slowly retreats. No great catastrophes intervene to change the face of the earth. Although sporadic volcanic action occurs, Lyell did not consider it to have an effect in changing the face of the earth comparable in importance to that of rivers, wind, and waves of the sea. What causes the eon-long process of elevation and subsidence has not been determined. Naturalists of the 18th century claim to have observed a minute gradual change in the level of the Gulf of Bothnia in the Baltic Sea. In relation to the coastline, similar processes in past geological ages must have brought about all the changes on the earth. The majestic mountains that rose and others that were leveled, the seacoasts that in a slow rhythm back and forth, and the earth mantle that was redistributed by rain and wind. According to the theory of uniformity, no process took place in the past that is not taking place in the present, and not only the nature, but also the intensity of physical phenomena of our age are the criteria of what could have happened in the past. Since the theory of uniformity is still taught in all places of learning, and to question it is heresy, it is pertinent to reproduce here some of Lyell's original statements made in his Principles of Geology. They served as a manifesto or credo for all his followers. Whether called uniformists or evolutionists, Lyell wrote, "It has been truly observed that when we arrange the known phosphorus formations in chronological order, they constitute a broken and effective series. We pass without any intermediate gradations from the systems of strata which are horizontal to other systems which are highly inclined, from rocks of peculiar mineral composition to others which have a character wholly distinct from the assemblage of organic remains to another, in which frequently nearly all the species and a large part of the genera are different. These violations of continuity are so common as to constitute in most regions the rule rather than the exception, and they have been considered by many geologists as conclusive in favor of sudden revolutions in the inanimate and animate world. Thus he acknowledged that the surface of the globe has the appearance of having been subjected to great and violent sudden changes, but he believed that the record is incomplete and that the major part of the evidence is lost. In the solid framework of the globe, we have a chronological chain of natural records, many links of which are wanting. To make this plausible, Lyell cited every year in 60 provinces. Changes in the population would appear to be very gradual, but if the census were taken every year in a different province, and in only one, the change in the population of each province between the visits of the census takers at 60-year intervals would be very great. Lyell maintained that this was the way geological deposits were made. The theory of uniformity, or of gradual changes in the past measured by the extent of changes observed in the present, has, as Lyell admitted, no positive evidence in the incomplete record of the Earth's crust. Consequently, the theory, building on argumentum ex silentio, or argument by default, required further analogies. Suppose we have discovered 2 buried cities at the foot of Vesuvius, immediately superimposed upon each other with a great mass of tuft and lava intervening. An antiquary archaeologist might possibly be entitled to infer from the inscriptions on public edifices that the inhabitants of the inferior and older city were Greeks, and those of the modern town Italians. But he would reason very hastily if he also concluded from these data that there had been a sudden change from the Greek to the Italian language in Campania. But if he afterwards found 3 buried cities, one above the other, the intermediate one being Roman, he would then perceive the fallacy of his former opinion, and would begin to suspect that the catastrophes by which the cities were inhumed might have no relation whatever to the fluctuations in the language of the inhabitants, and that, as the Roman tongue had evidently intervened between the Greek and Italian, so many other dialects may have been spoken in succession, and the passage from Greek to the Italian may have been very gradual. This often reprinted passage is an unfortunate example, for in order to prove that there had been no violent changes, Lyell chose to present a picture of violent catastrophes. The strata are separated by layers of lava. This is also the picture presented in so many geological surveys. To use this example as a proof of uniformity is a flight of dialectics. The comparison is followed by an accusation that is all the more vigorous because of the inadequacy of the example, which is called on to substitute for geological evidence, Lyle said. It appeared clear that the earlier geologists had not only a scanty acquaintance with existing changes caused by wind, flowing water, etc., but were singularly unconscious of the amount of their ignorance. They didn't know what they didn't know. With the presumption naturally inspired by this unconsciousness, they had no hesitation in deciding at once that time could never enable the existing powers of nature to work out changes of great magnitude. Still less such important revolutions as those which are brought to light by geology, and he proceeded, never was there a dogma more calculated to foster indolence and to blunt the edge of curiosity than this assumption of the discordance between the ancient and existing causes of change. It produced a state of mind unfavorable in the highest degree to the candid reception of the evidence of those minute but incessant alterations which every part of the earth's surface is undergoing. At first, the tone of this pleading for the then unorthodox theory of uniformity was defensive. Position was unsupported by sufficient evidence. Then, as though a few analogies to human situations were so strong that they could substitute for the defective record of nature, the tone changed and became uncompromising. Isn't that always the case? They're always humble at first. For this reason, all theories are rejected which involve the assumption of sudden and violent catastrophes and revolutions of the whole earth and its inhabitants, theories which are restrained by no reference to existing analogies, and in which a desire is manifested to cut, rather than patiently to untie, the Gordian knot. Notwithstanding the strong language employed, the scientific principle which insists that whatever does not occur at the present time has not occurred in the past. A self-imposed limitation. Rather than a principle in science, it is a statute of faith, and Lyle ended his famous chapter accordingly, with an appeal for faith and with a precept for believers. If he, the student, finally believes in the resemblance or identity of the ancient and present systems of terrestrial changes, he will regard every fact collected, respected the causes in diurnal action, as afforded him a key to the interpretation of some mystery in the past. End of subchapter. The hippopotamus inhabits the larger rivers and marshes of Africa. It is not found in Europe or America, save in zoological gardens, where specimens of it wallow most of the time in pools, submerging their huge bodies in the muddy water with that tooth. Next to the elephant, it is the largest of the land animals. Bones of hippopotami are found in the soil of Europe, as far north as Yorkshire in England. Lyle gave the following explanation for the presence for the hippopotamus in Europe. The geologist may freely speculate on the time when herds of hippopotami issued from North African rivers, such as the Nile, and swam northward in summer along the coasts of the Mediterranean, and even occasionally visited the islands near the shore. Here and there they may have landed to graze or browse, tarrying a while, and afterwards continuing their course northward. Others may have swum in a few summer days from rivers in the south of Spain or France to the Somme, Thames, or Severn River in Wales and England, making timely retreat to the south before the snow and ice set in. An arc from the rivers of Africa to the Isles of Albion sounds like an idyll. In the Victorian cave near Settle in West Yorkshire, 1,450 feet above sea level, under 12 feet of clay deposit containing some well-scratched boulders, were found numerous remains of the mammoth, rhinoceros, hippopotamus, bison, hyena, and other animals. In northern Wales, in the Vale of Clod, in numerous caves, remains of the hippopotamus lay together with those of the mammoth, the rhinoceros, and the cave lion. In the cave of K. Gwyn, in the Vale of Claude. During the excavations, it became clear that the bones had been greatly disturbed by water action. The floor of the cavern was covered afterwards by clays and sand containing foreign pebbles. This seemed to prove that the caverns, now 400 feet above sea level, must have been submerged subsequently to their occupation by the animals and by man. The contents of the cavern must have been dispersed by marine action during the great submergence in mid-glacial times, and afterwards covered by marine sands, writes H.B. Woodward. Hippopotami not only traveled during the summer nights to England and Wales, but also climbed hills to die peacefully among other animals in the caves and the ice. Approaching softly, tenderly spread little pebbles over the travelers resting in peace. And the land, with its hills and caverns, in a slow lullaby movement, sank below the level of the sea, and gentle streams caressed the dead bodies and covered them with rosy sand. 3 assumptions were made by the exponents of uniformity. Sometime not long ago, the climate of the British Isles was so warm that hippopotami used to visit there in summer. The British Isles subsided so much that caves in the hills became submerged. The land rose again to its present height, and all this without any action of a violent nature. Or it was, perchance, a mountain-high wave that crossed the land and poured into caves and filled them with marine sand and gravel? Or did the ground submerge and then emerge again in some paroxysm of nature in which the climate also changed? Did the animals run away at the sign of the approaching catastrophe? And did the trespassing sea follow and suffocate them in the caves that were their last refuge and became the place of their burial? Or did the sea sweep them from Africa, throw them in heaps on the British Isles and in other places, and cover them with earth and marine debris? The entrances to some caves were too narrow, and the caves themselves too shrunk, contracted, to have been places of refuge for such huge animals as hippopotami and rhinoceroses. Whichever of these answers or surmises is correct, and whether the hippopotami lived in England or were thrown there by the ocean, whether they sought refuge in caves, or the caves are but graves, their bones on the British Isles, as also on the bottom of the seas surrounding these islands, are signs of some great natural change. End of subchapter. Icebergs. The theory that rejected the occurrence of catastrophic events in the past is incompatible with the then prevailing teaching, which ascribed to the distribution of drift, the deposit of rock debris, clay, and organic material that covers continental areas, and of erratic boulders to the action of water in the form of great tidal waves breaking upon the continents. A slow-moving source, able to do the same work but in a longer time, had to be found. Lyell assumed that icebergs transferred rocks over the expanse of the sea. Icebergs are broken off parts of glaciers that descend from the mountainous coasts to the sea. Mariners in northern waters have observed icebergs with pieces of rock attached to them. And if we think of the enormity of the past geological epochs and multiply the action of icebergs as carriers of earth and rocks by the time elapsed, we may explain, so argued Lyell, the presence of erratic boulders, as well as of till and gravel on land. Erratic boulders are found far from the seashore. Lyell taught that the land was submerged and icebergs traveling over it dropped their load of stones. Later, the land emerged with the stones on it. Erratic boulders are found on mountains. Therefore, these mountains were under shallow water when icebergs, carrying stones from other regions, dropped them on the summits. In order to explain in this manner the provenance of erratic boulders, it was necessary to submerge large parts of continents in rather recent times. In some places, erratic boulders are distributed in a long string, as in the Berkshires. Icebergs could not have acted as intelligent carriers, and Lyell must have felt the weakness of his theory on this point. The only alternative known at that time was that of a tidal wave, but Lyell abhorred catastrophes. He detested them, alike the political life of Europe and in nature. Characteristically, his autobiography begins with this description of the most vivid memory of his earliest childhood. I was 4.5, and when an event happened which was not likely to be forgotten, his family traveled in 2 carriages, a stage and a half, Edinburgh, on the narrow road with a steep brow above and an equally precipitous one below, and no apparent on the roadside. A flock of sheep jumped down into the road and frightened the horses of the other carriage. Away they ran, and with the chase, man, horses, and all, disappeared clean out of sight, over the brow in an instant. There was a rescue through the broken pane of glass. A little blood ran, and somebody fainted. It left the first and strongest impression of his childhood in the memory of the author of The Theory of Uniformity. Oh, so it was a catastrophe. So his greatest memory was that of a catastrophe. That's kind of ironic, isn't it? I get it. The way he worded it was a little confusing. Leave it to a shrink like Dr. Velikovsky to figure that out. That's pretty good. Darwin in South America. Charles Darwin, who had previously dropped his medical studies at Edinburgh University, upon his graduation in theology from Christ College, Cambridge, once again, highly religious science man of the 19th century, went in December 1831 as a naturalist on the ship Beagle, which sailed around the world on a 5-year surveying expedition. Darwin had with him the newly published volume of Lyell's Principles of Geology. That became his Bible. On his voyage, he wrote in his journal, the second edition of which he dedicated to Lyell. This round-the-world voyage was Darwin's only fieldwork experience in geology and paleontology, and he drew on it all his life long. He wrote later that these observations served as the origin of all my views. His observations in the southern hemisphere, and more particularly in South America, a continent that had attracted the attention of naturalists since the exploration travels of Alexander von Humboldt, 1799-1804, Darwin was impressed by the numerous assemblages of fossils of extinct animals, mostly of much greater size than species now living. These fossils spoke of a flourishing fauna that suddenly came to its end in a recent geological age. He wrote under January 9, 1834, in the journal of his voyage, "It is impossible to reflect on the changed state of the American continent without the deepest astonishment. Formerly, it must have swarmed with great monsters. Now we find mere pygmies compared with the antecedent allied races." He proceeded thus: the greater number, if not all, of this extinct quadrupeds lived at a late period, and were the contemporaries of most of the existing seashells. Since they lived, no very great change in the form of the land can have taken place. What then has exterminated so many species and whole genera? The mind at first is irresistibly hurried into the belief of some great catastrophe, but thus to destroy animals both large and small, in southern Patagonia, in Brazil, on the Cordillera of Peru, in North America, up to Bering Straits, he must shake the entire framework of the globe. No lesser physical event could have brought about this wholesale destruction, not only in the Americas, but in the entire world. and such an event being beyond consideration, Darwin did not know the answer. But it could hardly have been a change of temperature, which at about the same time destroyed the inhabitants of tropical, temperate, and Arctic latitudes on both sides of the globe. Certainly it could not have been man in the role of destroyer, and were he to attack all large animals, would he also be the cause of extinction of the many fossil mice and other small quadrupeds? Darwin asked. No one will imagine that a drought could destroy every individual of every species from southern Patagonia to the Bering Straits. What shall we say of the extinction of the horse? Did those plains fail of pasture, which have since been overrun by thousands and hundreds of thousands of the descendants of the stock introduced by the Spaniards? Out of Darwin's embarrassment, and there is one very important fact, well, two very important facts that we can't lose sight of, and that is the Earth and Saturn are spot-on matches with their oxygen, their water, and the salt. That cannot be ignored. Okay, I'll stop. I just wanted to have that said.
And mankind today advanced enough in technology, produced thermonuclear weapons that could be like a symbol or something representing the ancient, violent celestial body that through fire and smoke disturbed the rotation of the earth. Now, if man is under the urge to repeat the ancient catastrophic events, the ancient trauma, are we not in a predicament? It is not a preaching to be better. It is a preaching to know yourself.
Dr. Velikovsky, what do you think is the effect of this collective amnesia in the future?
The effect is very great, not only in the future, it was also in the past. Because as long as a man doesn't remember his past, he acts as a neurotic, a person who suffered a traumatic experience. Due to this traumatic experience, suffered also an amnesia, a local amnesia, so to say, not spread off through all his personality. But in this case, in the human race, we have something that is comparable with a single personality that suffered a trauma.
You undertake to psychoanalyze mankind as a whole.
You realize that it's not easy to put the entire mankind on the couch, but all what I can do is publish the psychological aspect of these events, of which I spoke from biological and paleontological side, in Earth in Upheaval, from folkloristic side in worlds in collision, from archaeological side in ages and chaos.
Are there any rituals that we are practicing now which would seem to indicate a repetition of this trauma?
Not only any ritual, almost all rituals in religions, in various religions, all our observation in some way go back to the astral religion, to the beginnings that are rooted in the catastrophic events of the past.
And I think there's one question that runs through the mind, if not obsesses the minds of your readers, and that is, when can we expect the next catastrophe? And what I'd like to ask you is, how does the sky look to you?
I was asked this question almost at the end of every lecture. We are now living in a solar system in which, between the planetary bodies, the astral guards of all ancient religions, there exists now there a peaceful a harmony, peaceful coexistence. But it is the man himself, human mind, that is not released from the bonds of the past. He lives in a world that he created himself in his arrogance, in his violence, in his misunderstanding of what happened in the past, so he is irrational.